The Avro Shackleton's got a lot to live up to. Its family tree is its dad was the Lincoln bomber and its granddad was the Lancaster, one of the most famous bombers of the Second World War. So how does Junior stack up when it comes to the family tree? The design process for the Shackleton started pretty close to the end of the Lincoln bomber, and the purpose of the Shackleton was quite different. See, the Lincoln bomber was designed to cope with the fact that in the Pacific mission, where the focus was shifting, they needed strategic bombers with an incredibly long range and a big payload. But the Shackleton was designed to take advantage of those features, but then apply them to anti-submarine warfare. This was going to be a sub-hunter. In 1951, when this thing first went into service with the Coastal Command, the biggest threat was seen to be the ever-expanding Soviet Navy and the increasing number of submarines that they were quietly slipping into the Atlantic. After the experiences of the Second World War, where the German wolf packs and the U-boats had been such a threat and had almost undermined the war effort through destruction of supply lines from America to Europe, NATO and the North Atlantic countries in general didn't want to see this happen again. And part of the solution to that was to have an aircraft that had an exceptionally long loiter time and had the capacity to carry an array of weapons, but also all of the equipment it needed to detect submarines. And that's where the Shackleton came in. Unlike the Lincoln and the Lancaster before it, the Shackleton was kind of designed to be a little bit more crew friendly because they were expecting people to be in it for long patrols. Just like the Lancaster and the Lincoln, it has this huge ordnance bay, bomb bay basically, but this was a bit more than just a bomb bay because it had fittings for all kinds of weapons. It could carry torpedoes, it could carry nuclear depth charges, which feels a little bit overkill, but you know, whatever, Cold War. But it could carry all kinds of stuff in here. But beyond just being a huge bomb bay like those particular aircraft, up there it also had a huge array of electronics, anti-submarine warfare and radar and so on to detect them. But it also had some creature comforts to make the crew's life that little bit easier. And from that, it borrowed from the Tudor, which was the airliner version of the Lincoln bomber. So it borrowed a few bits from the Tudor and a few bits from the Lincoln, which are kind of sibling aircraft. And then together they made this, which is the Shackleton. This was working right the way through till 1991, and the anti-submarine role got taken over in the 70s by the Nimrod, and this took over from the Gannet to do the airborne early warning roles. And then eventually this was retired in, like I say, in 91 when the Centuries, the E3 Centuries took over. But it was quite a long-serving career for what's essentially a jazzed-up World War II bomber. It didn't entirely go without hiccups though. The initial version, the MR1, it didn't actually end up in service for that long. It was quite quickly replaced by the MR2. And some of the more obvious differences were the MR1 had the radar on the nose, whereas the MR2, it was moved to being under the belly. The MR1 has a slightly shorter nose, and what else? The MR1, well, essentially the prototype version, they had guns on it, they had refueling probes, they had all kinds of stuff. And they very quickly realised that all of this stuff was actually kind of negative to the performance of the aircraft in the role it wanted to do. It didn't need to have gun turrets all over it. It didn't need to have the refueling probe, or at least the refueling system didn't work as well as they'd kind of hoped it would. So in the end, a lot of this stuff was stripped off, and the MR2, in some people's opinion, became the definitive version. This is actually an MR3. The easiest way to tell is it's on tricycle landing gear. But the MR3 had quite a lot of modifications. It had a crew galley, it had bunks put in for the crew, it had extra avionic equipment put in. And the problem was all of these extras and additions actually made it a bit too heavy. So the MR3, or the Mark III as this is version airframes, ended up coming out of service before the MR2s because of airframe fatigue. So the MR2 versions ended up being the ones that actually served the longest, with a few of them being converted into MR3s anyway. But yeah, so the MR2 is apparently the one to have. In terms of power plants though, the Shackleton had some interesting ideas. So on the Lincolns and Lancasters, you had great big Merlin engines, which were great at working at altitude and spun at higher RPM. But the MR2, well, the Shackleton in general, was expected to operate at much lower altitudes. When it was in its sub-hunting mode, it could be doing a sustained flight at 150 meters for hours at a time. So what it needed was engines that could cope in that envelope. And for that, they turned to the Griffins. And the Griffins had a slower RPM to give the same power output as the Merlins. So it would turn slower and it would cope better at being in that thicker, lower air. But in turn, when you've got a big engine that runs at lower RPM, you need bigger propellers to take advantage of that power and to properly convert that power. But there isn't enough room on the front of it to stick huge propellers or to stick multi-bladed propellers beyond what it's got. So what it did was it used a little gearbox to then convert the power output of the Griffin into contra-rotating propellers. And that's what you've got here, two sets of propellers that spin in different directions, and they give it that kind of that bigger surface area, but without increasing the propeller size and adding those kind of problems. So that's how the Griffin solved it. But the Griffin wasn't without its drawbacks. It had a distinctive engine tone, and that's what gave early versions of this aircraft the nickname the Growler. Make of that what you will. But also they were incredibly loud, and despite the fact that there was more shielding, sound shielding inside, but it's part of the crew comforts that they built to it, the additional sound shielding wasn't enough. That a lot of the crews for these things did tend to get high-end hearing loss quite early in their career in operating these, because they were incredibly loud. But there's another interesting little addition to the Mark III version. The inboard engine is just a regular engine with its nacelle, and it's the one that contains the landing gear, so it's a little bit enlarged to allow room to stick that landing gear. But there's also something stuck inside of the outboard engines. One of the things you'll notice is this great big panel that drops down here on the outboard engine, and that opens up a great big air intake here, because at the back of the outboard engine what you've got is a Viper jet turbine engine. And the point of that was that because the Shackleton was so much heavier, especially the Mark III version, they needed the jet engine to give it that extra bit of push to get it off the ground. And initially it was only rated for takeoff, so they would turn this thing on just for takeoff, and then once you got up to cruising, you'd close up the air vent and shut this engine down. But because of the strain on the Griffins, because of the extra weight in the aircraft, they ended up rating these for 4-hour use at a time. So you could actually run these jets periodically during the flight to take some of the load off the Griffins, and that helped to prevent malfunctions and helped to kind of extend the service life of those big fat Griffin engines at the front of the aircraft. Despite the huge engines though and the extra crew comfort, and the fact that, to be fair, this thing did carry out its mission really well. And on top of that, it was versatile enough that this was also used in quite a lot of other roles in its lifetime. It did have one bad side to it, which was that it started to develop a reputation as being a bit of a crew killer. Unfortunately, because of the extra weight and because of the extremes they were pushing the airframe to, there is quite an extensive accident record associated with Shackletons. Not as bad as a lot of people make out. There's some people will tell you the Shackleton is like the #1 aircrew career ender in the RAF, but it's not that. Like the Gloucester Meteor ended the careers of probably 3 times the number of pilots that this did. But that said, it did have quite a high accident rate. So mostly that was down to it just being pushed to the top end of what the airframe could cope with. Another feature of the Mark IIIs was having wingtip fuel tanks to extend the range, but they've fallen off this one. In the end, the Mark III had its issues, and it did have a few shortcomings, and all of that was supposed to be addressed by a Mark IV, which was essentially just a few bits of the cockpit and avionics, but mostly it was an entirely new aircraft. But that project was cancelled because at that point, it was getting quite obvious that jets were the way to go. The Shackleton had run its course and it just didn't really have a future in that role. But that said, for the years that it did serve in the role it did, that's about 30, 40 odd years, it did it exceptionally well. And it was versatile enough that it managed to fill quite a few other roles as well. It was used briefly to do ground attack work. It was used to do surveillance. It was used to do the anti-submarine and so on that it was designed for. It fitted in, and it was even used as troop transport on occasion. it fitted into a lot of roller roles beyond what it was originally spec'd to do. But the Mark IV was not to be. And ultimately, I think the Shackleton, although it maybe didn't quite get the same fame and widespread usage as perhaps the Lancaster did, its granddad, I still think it's probably done a decent job of upholding the family honour. It's a good aircraft. It's just past its time. If you've enjoyed the video today, please consider a like and subscribe to support the channel, and feel free to watch one of the 2 videos suggested in these boxes.